from the world of Israeli politics or academia or history, and we talk about issues that are pertinent to Israel, the Middle East, or the Jewish world. I have a conversation with my guest for about 30-40 minutes, and then I turn it over to you to ask your questions. So I'm going to start by just inviting you all to, as I speak to our guest, please do write your questions into the chat at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a button labeled chat. You can write whatever questions you wish into there, and I will put those questions to our guest. So we had a bit of a break for the sort of national holidays of Israel, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, and we're going to be, I guess, kind of belatedly referring in a way to the first of those, to Yom HaShoah, in that we're going to be talking about the Holocaust in a specific way, or a way in which the Holocaust is talked about, discussed, and argued about in our own time, and it's not the sort of much more well-known and written about and understood Holocaust denial, which I think everyone on this call is fully conversant in, but Holocaust distortion, which is, I think, much less well-known, much less understood, perhaps also because of the geography that it's sort of focused almost entirely in Eastern Europe, not in the West, where I think most people on this call live or are from. And we have really the expert, the sort of primary fighter against this phenomenon, Dr. Efraim Zuroff, who is the director of the Israel office of the Simon Wiesenthal Center here in Jerusalem. He was born in New York. He has a BA in history from Yeshiva University and an MA and PhD in Holocaust studies from the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem. He's currently, as I said, the director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the chief Nazi hunter. That's quite a title. He's discovered the destinations all over the world of more than 3,000 suspected Nazi war criminals, and has facilitated the exposure and prosecution of dozens of them. In recent years, he's played a key role in identifying what we're going to talk about today, the phenomenon of Holocaust distortion in post-communist Eastern Europe, and he's one of the leading opponents of this phenomenon. He's the author of 4 books, more than 500 articles on Nazi hunting, Holocaust history, and contemporary Jewish life and identity, and he's one of the leading spokesmen in the world on Holocaust-related issues. His most recent book, which we're also going to discuss, co-written with Ruta Vanagate. I apologize if I garbled her name. It is in English, Our People, in Lithuanian, Musishkai. Dr. Zuroff will tell me if I got that right, which deals with Lithuanian complicity in the Holocaust, and it's been published in several languages, including English. Dr. Zuroff was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008. Efraim Zuroff, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. So let's start with some definition. As I said, I think Holocaust denial is well known to everybody. Holocaust distortion, much less known. Can you explain for us what it is? What are the Holocaust distorters trying to achieve in pushing this idea?
Okay, Holocaust distortion means that people do not deny that the Holocaust took place. They acknowledge the fact that there was a tragedy of this scope, but they are trying to do 4 things. One is to minimize or hide the role that their nationals played together with Nazi Germany. Now, we're talking about a phenomenon that's prevalent throughout post-communist Eastern Europe. And in order to understand this, we have to keep in mind a very important fact, which is that there was a very significant difference in the nature of collaboration with the Nazis between Eastern Europe and the rest of Europe. So let's think for a minute about Western Europe. Holland, Belgium, France, Italy, Greece. The Nazis collaborators helped implement the initial stages of what we call the final solution. They defined who's a Jew. They passed discriminatory legislation preventing the Jews from earning a livelihood, making their lives miserable, ultimately rounding them up and sending those Jews somewhere else to be murdered by someone else. In other words, these collaborators in these countries were never asked, neither did the Nazis demand from them that they carry out the systematic murder.
Right.
That was done somewhere else. That somewhere else was Eastern Europe, either in the death camps or in the other countries it was ensured by the Einsatzgruppen. But they want to, so in other words, their active participation, in other words, the Nazis actually integrated them into the framework of mass murder.
Yeah.
So if we talk about the Einsatzgruppen, who murdered 1.5 million Jews in the Eastern countries in less than 2 years, who was stretched from Tallinn, Estonia in the north, all the way to Odessa and the Black Sea in the south. And they numbered a couple of thousand people, not more.
Yeah.
And they murdered 1.5 million Jews. And what you have to keep in mind that those murders were carried out in a very labor-intensive way. In other words, each Jew had to be murdered individually. We're not talking about murdering people in death camps. We're talking about shooting people near their homes.
Yeah.
So one thing is to hide or minimize that participation. Another thing is they're pushing the canard of equivalency promoting the canard of equivalency between communist and Nazi crimes, and basically saying that communist crimes are just as bad or perhaps even worse than the Nazi crimes. And in fact, communist crimes are genocide. And this is a very important element of this, because if it's true, and it's not true, I mean, I don't want in any way minimize communist crimes. More people were victims of communist crimes, actually, which lasted far longer than Nazi crimes. But if that's the case, that means that Jews committed genocide, because there were Jewish communists who helped carry out discriminatory policies against the peoples of Eastern Europe, deport people to Siberia, to the Gulag, etc. And if Jews committed genocide, so how can the Jews complain about our so-called crimes? Right. Two other issues is the question of local heroes. Who are the local heroes in these new democracies? The local heroes are the people who fought against the Soviets after World War II. But 1 second, what happens if these people murdered Jews during the Shoah or helped murder Jews during the Shoah? That, in theory, should disqualify them. But it's not the case. Not in Lithuania and Latvia, Estonia, and other countries. And last but not least, they are lobbying for a joint Memorial Day for all the victims of totalitarian regimes. In other words, communism and Nazism. And of course, should that be accepted, should this initiative be embraced or endorsed, fully endorsed, who needs an International Holocaust Day? This day includes more victims, and you can throw out the International Holocaust Day.
Right. So if you follow this, and there's no difference between communism and Nazism, there's no difference between the murder of Jews and the murder of, say, Poles or Lithuanians by the Nazis or by the communists, in fact. By the communists. And therefore there's nothing unique about the Shoah. There's nothing unique about there's nothing special, if you like, or worthy of particular remembrance about the deliberate targeting for extermination of Europe's Jews. What about we're talking about obviously the post-communist situation, but I believe that in communist Eastern Europe, there was also an attempt by the communist regimes to kind of collapse all the victims of the Nazis together, right?
Correct. There was Soviet distortion. before the form that we know today and is so prevalent throughout post-communist Eastern Europe. So as far as the Soviets were concerned, they never were willing to acknowledge that the Jews were singled out for total annihilation. And for example, think about the huge mass murder sites of Eastern Europe. Take Babi Yar, for example. Babi Yar, September 29th, 30th, 1941, 33,700 Jews, mostly Jews, were murdered. How do I know the number? There was an exhumation made after the war was over. So we know the exact number of the victims. And for many years, there was no monument or memorial or museum to mark the spot. And then in the late 50s, I think this was, or maybe in the early 60s, someone in the Kiev municipality came up with this idea to build a football stadium in Babi Yar. And if not for the poem of the brave Russian non-Jewish poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who publicized his poem, Babi Yar, basically a cry for the victims, who knows, it might have happened. But once that poem was publicized, so a small monument was put on the scene. And the caption was very interesting. The caption was, "To the victims of fascism." Now, a wonderful caption, of course, which does not identify the perpetrators and does not identify the victims. So the same, by the way, when I visited Ponar outside Vilna in 1985, Rumbula outside Riga, and I know that the same is true in Mali Trustenic in Minsk, etc. That was the same inscription. Now, why was that the case? First of all, as I previously mentioned, the communists refused to identify, to admit that the Jews were subjected to a unique fate, that every Jew, in a sense, was a potential victim. Yeah. Now, one of the reasons was that they did not want to do anything to strengthen Jewish identity in the Soviet Union. Their goal was total assimilation of the Jewish population. And of course, one of the ironies of the story, I don't know how many of the people listening know this, but one of the first characteristics, one of the most important characteristics of the renaissance of Jewish identity in the Soviet Union, which began in 62, even before the Six-Day War, was Holocaust memory. Yeah. Jews in Riga used to go to Rumbula to clean the site. The site was totally abandoned, filthy, messy, and to have askarot over there, and that, in a sense, lit the flame of Jewish nationality, of Jewish ethnicity, and it was very important. It was a very important issue. The other point was that the Soviets consistently refused to identify the collaborators of the Soviet peoples. Now, part of that was because of the myth of the brotherhood of Soviet peoples. In other words, what ties together an Estonian, a Kazakh, a Tatar, a Korean, etc.? They supposedly are tied up in communism. That was, they're brothers in communism. One second, if that's the case, how could a Ukrainian communist murder a Jewish communist in Babi Yar, or help murder a Jewish communist? How could a Lithuanian communist murder a Jewish communist in Ponar? And the same in Rumbula and Latvia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the Soviet form of distortion. By the way, I don't know how many people know this, but that war that was fought from 1939 to 1945, they don't call it World War II. They call it the Great Patriotic War. And when I was stopped by customs in Moscow upon leaving the Soviet Union, and the customs agent said, "What are all those books there?" I said, "What are you talking about? This is about the Great Patriotic War." And he let me through.
Right. So we have this kind of this situation in the Soviet era, and then as you first explained, now in post-Soviet Eastern Europe, there's this as you said, the canard of equivalence, where just talking about totalitarianism, which includes Nazism and communism, and which also includes, as you said, the venerating of national heroes who also happened to be murderous anti-Semites. You said that there's this difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe in the nature of Nazi occupation and the fact that the Eastern Europeans themselves were involved in the killing. I mean, would it be, I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like you to expound on it. It would be fair to say, would it not, that in many of these countries, all of these countries, there were many all too willing collaborators in the killing of Jews?
That is undoubtedly true. We know, for example, that in a small country like Lithuania, there were more than 25,000 people who participated in some way, shape, or form in the process of mass murder. Now, remember, in Lithuania, there were 220,000 Jews who lived under the Nazi occupation, of whom 212,000 were murdered. We know that 90% of them were murdered by shooting near their homes, in the vicinity of their home villages and towns. So there's an amazing statistic that I learned that not long ago from Christoph Dickmann, who's probably the world's leading expert on the Holocaust in Lithuania. And that is, believe it or not, there were less than 1,000 Germans in Lithuania during the Nazi occupation. I'll tell you, I was shocked.
Wow.
I was shocked. And 90% of those Jews, of the 96.4% of the Jews who were murdered in Lithuania, they were shot near their homes. They were killed individually by shooting. Towards the end, when they emptied out the Lithuanian ghettos, Kovna, Šiauliai, Panevėžys, and Vilna, so the people were sent to camps. But the overwhelming majority were shot, and the overwhelming number of them were shot by their neighbors or by other Lithuanians. And this is one of the things that makes it that difficult for Lithuanians to accept. I mean, all strata of Lithuanian collaboration with the Nazis encompassed all strata of Lithuanian society. So I'll give you an example. Most people don't know the history of Lithuania. Lithuania was initially part of the Tsarist Empire. In 1918, after World War I, in the wake of Wilson's self-determination of nations, they received independence for the first time in hundreds of years. They became an independent republic. But in 1940, a year before the Nazi invasion, the Russians invaded Lithuania, occupied Lithuania. And what happened was that all the leaders of the political parties in Lithuania, I mean, it was a democracy, it was a quasi-democracy, I should say, ran away to Berlin and sat in Berlin under the aegis of Adolf Hitler and expressed their support for Adolf Hitler and sent messages of incitement into Lithuania saying the day of reckoning against the Jews is coming. The day of reckoning is coming. Any Jew who betrayed Lithuania will be punished, or in some cases even worse, they talked about. So it's not surprising that in more than 40 villages and towns, there were physical attacks on Jews before the first Nazi even showed their faces.
Right. And
it came from the top. The other part was just one other thing, Paul. In our book, Ruta did the research on the three elements of Lithuanian society: the political leadership, and then also on the local administration. What happened was in 1940, when the Russians occupied Lithuania, they fired all the Lithuanian bureaucrats and they went home. And when the Nazis came, their leadership in Berlin told them, come back to serve the Nazis. So they were super involved in the logistics of carrying out the mass murders. They were the ones who got people to arrest the Jews, guard the Jews, found the people who would carry out the murders. And they played a very, very integral, important, significant role in the mass murders. And then you have the killing squads, one of which actually was sent to Belarus, where they murdered at least 20,000 Belarusian Jews. And they also murdered more than 5,000 foreign Jews from Germany, Austria, and France who were brought to Lithuania to be murdered. So little Lithuania, we had 2.5 million people basically was responsible for the murder of 250,000 Jews.
And obviously, you've just written this book, co-written this book, and I've just linked in the chat to the Amazon page for that book for our audience to view later if they wish to purchase the book. But I mean, relating to Lithuania and maybe also other countries in this region, what does your research tell you about the nature of this? Not just anti-Semitism, but actually sort of genocidal. I mean, is it a kind of the older, centuries old anti-Semitism that came from the church and other things? Was it that they associated Jews with communism and therefore they saw them as part of the kind of the Bolshevik threat? Equating Jews with communism. Was it both of those in these countries?
Okay, first of all, Lithuania was not the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. As a matter of fact, if someone had said to you, this is what historians say, let's say in 1920, a terrible tragedy will take place to European Jewry, and many Jews will be murdered or will be killed. What country do you think this will happen in? This is before the rise of the Nazis. So the answers were Hungary, Romania, or Poland. They were the most anti-Semitic countries. You had pogroms, you had other things, you had quotas. Hungary was the first country in 1920 that instituted anti-Semitic quotas. For example, the Romanians didn't want to give Jews citizenship. There's all sorts of things and a lot of discrimination. But that wasn't the case in Lithuania. The second point that you raised was super critical, especially in view of the year of Soviet occupation. In other words, the Soviets opened up certain jobs that had been closed to the Jews. The Jews were almost barred, I would say, with very few exceptions, they were barred from the Lithuanian civil service. In other words, they couldn't be a high cleric official in the municipalities or in the government. They couldn't rise high in the army, although many Lithuanian Jews, for example, fought for Lithuanian independence in World War I and were decorated as such. And so the Jews, in a sense, took advantage of the Soviets' lack of anti-Semitism and refusal to discriminate against Jews in certain forms of employment.
Yeah.
So that strengthened the Judeo-Bolshevism myth.
Right.
And that was a major consideration. And when our book came out, Musishki, which means our guys, and there's two pictures on the cover. One is of a Jew as a cyclist, Yitzhak Anolik. The other one is of one of the murderers of the special murder squad in Ponar.
Yeah.
And Ruta, who is a Lithuanian author herself, she wanted to send a message. Lithuanian society thinks that neither the victims, they're a bunch of Jews, they're Bolsheviks, they sent us to Siberia, we couldn't trust them. Or the killers, they're a bunch of degenerates, illiterates, social misfits. She basically wanted to say, you try and say that these two groups are not part of Lithuanian society, but there's no question that they're an integral part of Lithuanian society.
Wow. Okay, so there's a couple more points I want to raise. I want to also encourage our audience to write your questions into the chat. So when we get to those, there'll be some questions for me to put to Dr. Zuroff. Let's also talk about another country that sort of comes to mind when I think of this Holocaust distortion phenomenon is Poland, because it's been very much in the news in recent like last couple of years, I guess, in terms of relations with Israel, and a lot of criticism by the Israeli government of changes in the law, in the Polish law regarding restitution for Jewish property and that kind of thing, and certainly the noises coming out of the Polish government, this sort of very kind of nationalist Polish government that's been in power for a few years now, has really sort of moved Poland into this camp of basically just wanting to have nothing to do with the idea that Poles were part of the Holocaust as perpetrators. Can you say something about Poland?
Sure, of course. So let's take the bill of 2018. There were two parts to the bill, one totally justified and one totally unjustified.
Okay.
The first part forbade the use of the term Polish death camps. And the truth of the matter is that they were not Polish death camps. They were Nazi camps built on Polish soil.
Right.
The Poles did not build them. The Poles, unlike the other Eastern Europeans, like Ukrainians, like Demjanjuk, and Latvians and Lithuanians who served in those camps, there were no Poles who served in those camps. The only Poles in those camps were Polish inmates of the camps, especially in Auschwitz and in Majdanek. So that's justified. And they're right to ask people and historians not to use that term. The other aspect, the other term was that anyone who attributed the crimes of the Holocaust to the Polish nation, that's a offense that can be punished by imprisonment for 2 years. So let's start with the fact that the Polish government didn't exist. In other words, there was a government in exile. The Polish state did not exist. Right. The government in exile certainly did not encourage crimes against Jews, even though there were two undergrounds in Poland: the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, which refused to accept Jews and could have saved the lives of many Jews had they accepted Jews. And then there's the Armia Ludowa, the People's Army, which was the communist underground, and they accepted Jews. Now, Poland poses a special instance, a special case, because unlike Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, etc., the Poles were not integrated into the mechanism of mass murder. In other words, we know today, thanks to the wonderful research of Barbara Engelking, Jan Grabowski, Jan Gross, people who wrote about the role of Poles in the murder of Jews. And now there's a book that came out recently in English called The Towns of Death by Miroslav Trishik, his name is pronounced, I think. This whole issue arose when Jan Gross, who's he lives in America, he's of Polish origin, his father was Jewish, wrote about the town called Jedwabne, in which it was the Poles that murdered the Jews. And the monument that was established there was that the Hitlerite fascists are the ones who murdered the Jews. Now we know that it wasn't only at Jedwabne, Brazilov and other cities, or in Eastern Poland, more than 24, I think. And this book came out now. It's a horrific chronicle of mass murder of Jews by Poles and their neighbors, basically by their neighbors.
Yeah.
So the difference was, in a sense, that those murders were personal initiative. Okay. In other words, that what fed those murders was the horrific anti-Semitism of Poland before World War II. You had a party called the National Democrats, the Index. They wanted to get the Jews out of Poland. They were talking about removing 1 million Jews from Poland. Stark anti-Semitism by the clergy, by the right-wing politicians. And that formed the basis in the background for horrible things. And of course, the year of more actually in Eastern Poland was more than a year. The occupation of Eastern Poland by the Soviets from September 17th till the outbreak of World War II. And the communists deported thousands of Poles and took actions against the Poles. And here you go again with the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. What I try to explain to people is it's as if they thought that they were taking their orders from Jerusalem. These were the people who left, who cut off their ties with Jerusalem. These are people who for Brent are communists and not loyal members of the Jewish community.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. That's really. There's. I'm sure there's a lot more we can say. I think we'll get to some more of that in questions. But one more question from me before we turn to our audience. Obviously, a lot of the world's attention right now is on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the conflict there, the horrific crimes being committed, I think it'd be fair to say, in Ukraine by Russian forces. And Volodymyr Zelensky has been sort of held up as a hero by many people, including many in Israel, not least because he's Jewish. But when he gave his speech to members of Knesset, there was one sort of point in the speech which went down very badly with many of the people who heard it here in Israel, in that it essentially seemed to kind of go along this kind of distortion line, right? It seemed to talk about Ukraine as Ukrainians sort of helping the Jews in the Shoah, denying the fact that Ukrainians, or not mentioning that Ukrainians had in fact also been perpetrators in the Holocaust. What do you have to say about Ukraine as one of the countries in this distortion mix?
So first of all, there's no question that the Ukrainians were among the worst promoters of Holocaust distortion. And there, I would point to two things that are very important. First of all, to hide or minimize their crimes. And second of all, to glorify people who were mass murderers of Jews. And let me give you two examples. So the biggest hero in Ukraine since independence has been Stefan Bandera. Stefan Bandera was the head of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the B faction, the Bandera faction. His men joined with the Nazis in the initial weeks of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Eastern Poland and Ukraine, and murdered thousands of Jews in Lvov. We call it Lvov, they call it Lviv. Excuse me, in Tarnopol and other places. Second of all, the head of the UPA, the UPA, the army, insurgent army of the Ukrainian Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was headed by Roman Shushkevich. Roman Shushkevich led his men and the mass murder of tens of thousands of Jews and Poles in the Volyn province in 1943, 1944. Now, I mean, how can you, they made Bandera's birthday a national holiday in Ukraine. January 1st is a national holiday. And there are torchlight parades in many cities in Ukraine. His picture is all over. And the same is true of Shushkevich. Now, you're talking about a country whose biggest hero is Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1648, 1649, led the pogroms of the Cossacks, where 200,000 Jews were murdered. Add to that Petlura, Simon Petlura, who in the wake of World War I and the short-lived Ukrainian state republic that was created, 100,000 Jews were murdered in pogroms. The only reason we don't remember it is because World War II was so much worse. So, and Zelensky's claim, there's no comparison between the number of Ukrainians who murdered Jews to the number of Ukrainians who saved Jews. Now, we cherish the memory and we, in many cases, assist those righteous among the nations. And there are Ukrainians and there are Lithuanians and there are Latvians, okay? But there's no comparison numerically between their number and the number of people who were out there killing our brethren and our families and helping the Nazis. And their hope, of course, was for a Judenrein Ukraine.
So when, Putin justifies the invasion of Ukraine with this talk of quote unquote denazifying Ukraine. So some might sort of jump on the history that you've just told us and say, well, this is maybe what Putin is talking about. Do you have any sympathy with that?
No, that's not what he's talking about, because what he said was prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think it was on February 24th, Putin said, we are launching a special military operation to denazify Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine is a Nazi state. That's certainly not true. And I have news for you. There are, and one thing I didn't mention is there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Some of them in the Azov regiment serve in the military. But I can promise you that there are probably far more neo-Nazis in Russia than there are in the Ukraine. Nice. Ukraine is not a Nazi state. Now, but on the other hand, take a look at what the Ukrainians are trying to do. The president of the Ukrainian parliament, what's his name, Ruslan Stefanchuk, started talking about Bucha, the tragedy of Bucha. This is the Holocaust of the 21st century. What happened in Bucha is a tragedy. It's a war crime, but it barely is surpasses a couple of streets in the Warsaw Ghetto. There is the Soviets, the Russians, excuse me, are not out to kill every Ukrainian. It's pure fiction. But I'll tell you something. You know what? This is the price of success. I want to be frank with you. On the one hand, what does it show? It shows that the people who've devoted our lives to the history of the Shoah, teaching the Shoah and all that, we have solidly convinced the world that the Holocaust is the worst tragedy in the annals of mankind. Okay, now we're paying the price. Everyone wants to tie their tragedy to the Shoah.
Everything's the new Shoah, yeah.
And it'll help them, they think it'll help them enlist support, get money, arms, you name it.
Interesting. Okay. All right, let's get to some questions that have started coming in. So Tzvi Berg asks actually about the work that you've been doing. And he says, have you or others had any success in reversing the Holocaust distortion policies in these countries, in the Eastern European countries?
Okay, so that's a very good question. This is a very long and difficult process. And to give you an example, it took France 50 years before Jacques Chirac admitted that the French government has responsibility for Vichy.
Vichy, yeah.
So you have to understand that some of these countries are nebuch little countries who don't even begin to approach the resources and power of a country like France. And so it's not so surprising that they're still busy with the lies. But I can tell you that our book was a runaway bestseller, 20,000 copies in Lithuanian, the most popular book for 3 years running in the public libraries. Wow. And it was read primarily by the elderly and by the very young. In other words, the people who grew up in the EU read it, and the people who lived through it read it. And the people who lived through it, so half of them don't believe it. But half finally began to understand that what happened in their village actually happened all over the country. And it's a national tragedy. And of course, our hope is the younger people, better educated, grew up in a democracy, grew up in a EU country.
Yeah.
They're the ones who will ultimately make that change. But I have to say that here and there we see signs in the political leadership of the beginnings of maybe making slightly different comments. I mean, this is coming from the top. And I want to draw a straight line between the dedication in 1991 of the monument at Ponar and things that happened more recently. So, as I told you, originally the monument in Ponar had the caption "to the victims of fascism," but once Lithuania became independent, they realized that they needed a better caption and a better monument. And a survivor of Vilna from Ashdod named Yoshua Spiegel paid for a beautiful monument with captions in 4 languages, in Russian, Lithuanian, Hebrew, and Yiddish. And it spoke about the murder of the Jews by the Nazis and their helpers. They refused to say their local helpers because then they would say, well, then every Lithuanian is guilty. In any event, the keynote speaker at the ceremony was Gediminas Vagnorius, the Prime Minister of Lithuania. And he began by saying, all of this took place in a little more than an eye blink, 3 months. There were a lot of Jews there that day, believe me, and they're all looking at each other. What? What's he talking about 3 months? 3 years. And then he says, the misdeeds of a couple of degenerates, criminal elements, cannot besmirch the reputation of a country where so much assistance was given to the Jews. Gott in Himmel. When I heard that, I said, we are in big trouble. If I'm hoping to get the Lithuanians to put the Nazi war criminals who were deported from America back to Lithuania, I'm going to have a hard time. And indeed, there were 3 trials, but not a single one ever sat one day in jail.
Wow.
And they weren't even forced to show up for the trials. I'll tell you, it was absurd, absolutely absurd. One of them showed up of his own volition all of a sudden. Instead of reading him the indictment, what do you do if the guy, if a defendant shows up? First of all, you read him the indictment. You read him what he's being charged with. They didn't read him anything. They said, Mr. Lalakis, do you have something to say for yourself? Yes, I did it for my country. And he got a heart attack on the spot.
So wait, just to sort of follow up on this, what kind of reception do you get in these countries? Because I would imagine you're probably quite unpopular in some of them.
Paul, that's the understatement of the century. I am the most hated Jew in at least 4 countries: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Croatia.
Okay.
But having said that, I was honored by Serbia and Croatia because one of the presidencies in Croatia was of an anti-fascist. So that was one of the results.
Wow. Okay. The price you pay for your work, I guess. So there's a question here from Rivka Feinberg. She says, Holocaust distortion and minimization continue to be strong tenets of anti-Semitism today. Do you think these phenomena will continue to gain momentum as we move farther from the Shoah and there are less survivors to tell their stories to live audiences?
No, I don't think that's the case. I'm very happy that, for example, that this year, IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a consortium of 34 countries trying to promote Holocaust research and education, has specifically come out against Holocaust distortion, explaining that Holocaust distortion is a source of anti-Semitism. That IRA are the same ones with the definition of anti-Semitism, by the way.
Yeah.
So successful. But the problem in IRA is that everything has to be done by consensus. So the irony of the story is that the biggest distorters are all signing this declaration against distortion, and they're continuing to distort.
Right. There's a comment. It's more of a comment than a question, but I'd like your comments nonetheless. Annie says that she wants to mention Bulgaria, as it's important to single out Bulgaria, this one country that in Eastern Europe which did protect its Jews in spite of the king being a Nazi sympathizer and the country being part of the Axis.
Okay.
What do you say?
My comment is, don't tell that to a Jew from Macedonia. And I'll explain to you why. When Yugoslavia was occupied by the Germans and the Italians, they carved up the country into different slices. And one of those pieces was Macedonia, which was turned over to Bulgaria because they joined the Axis. In 1943, the Bulgarians rounded up the Jews of Thrace, Macedonia, and a small area of Romania, I think it is, 11,343 Jews, all sent to Treblinka. They are denying it. That's part of the distortion in Bulgaria. What is true is that the Bulgarian government did not deport its own Jews. And the credit for that goes to some of the most fantastic advocates or opponents of the Nazis, but in this case, advocates for the Jewish population, Dmitry Peshev, the deputy speaker of the parliament, someone who was considered a bit of an anti-Semite, by the way, before the war. He came out and he fought like a lion together with Metropolitan Cyril, Metropolitan Stefan, the leaders of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, against the deportation of the Jews. So there are people who attribute it to Boris, King Boris, but apparently he's not the one who deserves the credit. Wow. That's number one. And number two, the Bulgarians are doing everything possible not to admit their crimes in Macedonia.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna ask people to continue putting their questions in. In the meantime, one of the controversies that sort of Israel has been dealing with, or dilemmas, we should say, that Israel's been dealing with in recent years, has been that when Israel looks at the EU, it can see that many of the Eastern European countries are much more favorable to Israel's diplomatic positions, especially vis-a-vis the Palestinians, than its old Western European allies. So we've had a situation where the Israeli government has sought to sort of keep very good relations with Eastern European countries, perhaps even at the expense of not criticizing or condemning as much as it should this distortion. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a very accurate assessment. The strategy which was pursued by Netanyahu was to try and create a wedge between the Western Europeans who are obsessed with the Palestinians,
right,
the Eastern Europeans who couldn't care less about the Palestinians. So I'll give you an example, and I have to say something, and I think it's a fair assumption that many of the people who are listening to us are, like me, Israelis by choice. Okay? Yeah. I came to Israel because I wanted to live in a Jewish country with Jewish priorities, Jewish values, etc. Bibi went to Lithuania and praised the Lithuanians for the way they're commemorating the Shoah. That's like praising the Ku Klux Klan for improving race relations in America. This is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. And he's a Litva, Bibi. His family, Milikovsky, is a Lithuanian family. Listen, there's no excuse for this. These little countries, I sometimes call them verstunkene countries, you'll excuse me. So the little ones, especially in the Baltics, they're emptying out. They need us far more than we need them. And I think it's entirely legitimate to say to them, we appreciate your friendship. We're very glad we're not holding the crimes of the grandparents against the grandchildren. We're not going after any of them, any of the criminals. They're almost all of them are dead. But we will not countenance the false history of the Shoah that you're promoting. And to do it in a polite way, not to hit him over the head with a 100-pound bat. Right. There are ways of doing it. But I mean, listen, and everyone knows if Israel doesn't protest, it's green light on the lies. And everyone proceeded. In the beginning, listen, it's very interesting because when these countries became independent, they realized that they had to mend fences with the Jews because their main foreign policy objective was to gain entry to the European Union or to NATO. In other words, who can defend little Lithuania with its 4-plane air force? I don't know, by now maybe they have more. But Latvia, 2.5 million people, Estonia, 1.6. Who's going to save them? The only way they can protect themselves against the return of Russia is those organizations, European Union and NATO. And they thought, I always say, the only place that they still believe that protocols of the elders of Zion is in Eastern Europe. In other words, they were convinced that the road to Brussels and to Washington goes through Jerusalem. Okay, let them think that. Loch Batley. But so in other words, they tread very, very carefully. They didn't spread these lies so rapidly or so willingly, or whatever one you say. They knew they had to. But the minute they got into NATO, into the European Union, and Israel didn't bother them, Gott den Himmel, it was a disaster.
Right. That's It's I guess it's this sort of question of how the responsibilities of an Israeli government or prime minister, without specifically sort of targeting Netanyahu, but like any Israeli prime minister or government, that they have this dual responsibility of the state of Israel, but also the fact that it's a Jewish state and everything that entails. Right. So Sandra has a question here about Nazis who went to South America to live in South America. Why couldn't anything happen to them there in spite of the governments there only helping them stay safe? She says that many are in Chile.
Okay, first of all, the Nazis who went to South America were the very prominent Nazis who knew that they had to run because they would be looking for them and they would be put on trial.
Right.
With two separate networks. One run by an Austrian priest named Alius Hudel out of a seminary in Rome. Another one run by a Rustasha Croatian priest, Kronoslav Dragonovic. But the good news really was that after the transition to democracy in Argentina, quite a few of those criminals were sent to trial. So, and in Bolivia as well. And as Klaus Barbie, in 1983, if I'm not mistaken, was sent to France to be prosecuted, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. As far as in Argentina, Josef Schwamberger, the commandant of three forced labor camps, Przemysl, Radzwilov, and Militz, was turned over, actually found by the Wiesenthal Center, or helped find the Wiesenthal Center, helped find him. Dinko Šakić, I had the privilege of helping to see to it that he was sent back to Zagreb, extradited to Zagreb. He was the commandant of Jasenovac, the worst camp in the Balkans, camp where at least 100,000 people were murdered, Serbs, Jews, Gypsies, and Roma, and anti-fascist Croatians. His wife was extradited, and others. So it took a long time, but only when these countries became democracies and they dropped the dictatorship could anything actually be done. It was already late. Many people like Rushman and others and Ralph died in South America. Walter Ralph was the person who devised the gas vans. The Mossad tried to kill him, but his maid came to the door and she started screaming, and then the Mossad agents ran away. Herbert Sukors, the deputy commandant of the Aras Commando, was actually executed by the Mossad in Uruguay. He was living in Brazil. And the Russians asked for he committed his crimes in Latvia. The Russians asked for his extradition. The Brazilians said, we'll only extradite him to the country where he committed his crime, which of course didn't exist. And Israel was getting really antsy because in Germany, they were talking about a statute of limitations on Nazi war crimes. In other words, on regular murder, pardon my expression, there was a statute of limitations in Germany, and that was not applied for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But in 64, wait a second, it's 64, 19 years after the end of World War II, they started talking about perhaps applying it to Nazi crimes as well. Israel wanted to send Germany a message. If you stop prosecuting, we will start executing. And the person that was chosen was Herbert Sukors, who was the deputy commandant of the Aras Commando, ARAJS, one of the worst murder squads, a Latvian murder squad in Latvia and in Belarus. They also function in Belarus. And Mossad sent an agent who lured Sukors to Uruguay because in Brazil, there was a death penalty for attempted murder or murder. And the Mossad was afraid that if someone got caught, that person would be executed. So they lured him to Uruguay, where there was no death penalty, and they wanted to have a field trial. But the minute he walked into the house that was rented by the Mossad, he started fighting with people. It took 7 people to nail him down.
Wow.
And instead of having a trial and reading him all the crimes, they just executed him. And they left his body in this place. And once all the Mossad operatives had left South America, someone called the AP, I think it was, or the local news agency, go to such and such address, you'll find something of interest. And a note was pinned to his body, those who will never forget.
Wow.
And to this day, Israel has never taken credit for it, by the way, even though they allowed the agent who pulled this off to write a book.
And Germany never did apply the statute of limitations.
No. It came up again in 69, was rejected, then again in 79, and then they decided we will never have a statute of limitations on Nazi war crimes.
Okay. And what's the current situation? What's the current state of play in the year 2022? Are there still, for those of us that aren't following this the way you follow it, of course, are there currently Nazi war criminals who are on trial, who are awaiting trial, who we know are at large but haven't been caught yet, like specific people that we know where they are? What's the current situation?
Current situation is that there are 2 trials currently in progress, both in Germany. One is of the secretary of the commandant, Paul Hoppe, of the Stutthof concentration camp near Gdansk in Poland. Second one is of a SS guard in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin. He is 101 years old. The secretary is 96 years old. There are 8 more investigations going on, which we hope will yield trials. These trials will probably end in June. There'll probably be a verdict in June. They are the 6th and the 7th trials since there was a dramatic change in German prosecution policy 13 years ago, when it became possible to prosecute any person who served in a death camp, that's a camp with apparatus for mass murder, or in a concentration camp with a very high mortality rate at the later stages, based on service alone, of accessory to murder. And by the way, one of the most interesting parts of this is that this is linked to the plotters of 9/11, believe it or not. So where did the plotters of 9/11 live?
In Germany.
In Germany, in Hamburg, right?
Right.
So with the exception of Muhammad Atta, who flew one of the planes, the others didn't pull a trigger. They didn't kill anybody, with their own hands. And the Germans were very anxious to prosecute them. So they were put on trial for accessory to murder. So 2, I call them tzaddikim, Chasidei Moto Olam, 2 lawyers who worked in the German Federal Central Office for the Clarification of Nazi War Crimes, Thomas Walter and Kirsten Getzer, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. I can't praise them enough. Went to their bosses and said, why don't you apply the same thing regarding death camp guards? In other words, the death camps were created to kill innocent people. These people served there. Anyone who served there was part of the operation, and they can be put on trial for accessory to murder. So far, there have been 5 trials. 1 was stopped for medical reasons, but the others were all ended in convictions. And there are 2 more going on, and there are at least 8 investigations going on. All these people are examined by special geriatric experts, doctors, whether or not they are capable of standing trial, or how many hours a week they can stand, how many sessions, etc. And I can tell you that the trials are getting great coverage, especially in Germany, but not only in Germany. And in Germany, there's a special how should I put it? If someone lost a first-degree relative in the camp where the defendant served, when he was serving there, they can join the prosecution, okay? And they can speak in court, they can ask questions, and they're called Nebenklage, that's the term in German. And so our job, or our contribution, was to find survivors to testify, but also to find Nebenklage who wanted to join. And I can tell you that it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that gives the relatives closure. Listen, no one can bring back their loved ones. We can't bring back a single Jew who was murdered in the Shoah, Litzareno. But at least we can see to it that these people are brought to justice. And in these cases, listen, everyone knows about Auschwitz, but not that many people know about Stutthof. The Nazis actually built the gas chamber in Stutthof in spring of 43. And all of a sudden, Stutthof became a camp of the final solution. In the beginning, it was a camp for Poles. So Polish resistance fighters were sent there, clergy was sent there, intelligentsia. the Nazis wanted to totally repress the Polish people. But in 1943, when they built this gas chamber, then it became a camp of the final solution. People evacuated, primarily women, from the ghettos of Lithuania. Others who were sent from Hungary to Auschwitz, but Auschwitz could not accommodate them, also sent. So 65,000 victims, 28,000 Jews, mostly women. And I'll tell you one thing that is really important. The verdict in the last case that reached a conclusion, in the case of Bruno Day, who was a watchtower guard in Stutthof, the verdict was written by a judge named Anne Maya Goring. And she wrote what I have to say is probably one of the most brilliant verdicts in a Nazi war crimes trial. She tore to pieces all the arguments against these belated trials. In other words, that the defendants are old, that other people of higher ranks didn't get prosecuted, that he was only a small cog. She said, there's no such thing as a small cog. And every year we issue a report, which is available on our website, swcjerusalem.org, on investigation, prosecution of Nazi war criminals. And we translated, not we translated, but we obtained an English translation of Judge Maya Goring's verdict, and we included it in our annual report. It's a document that we feel should be taught in every school in the world.
Wow. Okay. So I've just written in the chat the website for the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem, and also my email for those who are not on my mailing list and would like to be, to hear about the events that we do here in English, both on Zoom and in person. I want to thank Dr. Efraim Zuroff enormously for not just for appearing before us all today, but also for the extraordinary work that he's been doing for so many years, which I think, if it wasn't clear before, is certainly clear to all of us now, just how important it is, and how vital it is that someone and some organization is pursuing justice, even so many decades after the greatest crime against the Jewish people and the greatest crime against humanity that we've seen. And I want to thank Efraim Zuroff very much for everything he does in his capacity as director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem, and everything he's done for the Jewish people. Thank you, Efraim, very much.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you for joining us today and speaking to us and informing us about Holocaust distortion, which, as I said, is much less well known than Holocaust denial, but clearly is something that we need to be aware of and to be keeping an eye on as it emerges in Eastern Europe. So thank you, Efraim. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be back next week, and I wish everyone a wonderful evening, day, depending what time of day it is, wherever you are. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.